Startup approved. Report when ready to taxi. Pushback, taxi to holding point run. Pushback up, departure run. Taxi to holding. Pushback approved at own discretion.
Departure runway.
Startup approved. Report, contact taxi to holding point runway. 27. Departure runway. Taxi to hold. Startup approved. Departure runway. 2. Pushback approved at own discretion. Pushback approved at own. Taxi to holding point. Taxi. Startup approved. Taxi to hold. Cross run. Contact tower on. Pushback approved at own discretion. Taxi to holding point runway. Taxi to holding. Cross runway approved.
Right.
Startup approved. Contact tower on. 1. Startup approved. Cross runway approved.
Startup approved.
Contact taxi to holding point runway. 2. Departure runway. Taxi to holding. Contact tower. Departure runway. Departure runway. 2. Departure runway. Pushback approved at own discretion. Pushback. Taxi. Departure runway. 2. 7. Taxi to holding point. Taxi to holding point. Taxi to departure runway. Departure runway. 2. 7. Contact taxi to holding point. Startup. Contact tower on. 1 2 0. Pushback approved at own discretion. Pushback left approved. Departure runway. 2 7. Contact tower on. Startup approved. Taxi to holding point runway. Taxi to hold. Startup. Contact tower on. 1 2 0 decimal 5 0. Pushback. Taxi to holding point runway. 2. Startup approved. Startup approved. Pushback left approved.
Holding point runway. 2 7.
Contact. Pushback approved at own discretion. Startup approved. Report when ready to taxi. Departure runway. 2 7. Contact tower on. 1. Taxi to holding point. Depart. Pushback approved at own discretion.
Request.
Startup approved. Pushback approved at. Pushback approved at. Startup. Taxi to holding point runway. 2 7. Pushback approved at own. Pushback approved. Taxi to holding point runway. 2. Contact tower on. Start. Departure runway. 2 7. Contact when ready to start. Contact tower on. 1 2. Departure runway. 3 4. Contact when ready. Taxi to hold. Departure run. Startup approved. Pushback approved. Taxi to holding point runway. Pushback contact tower. Pushback approved. Taxi to hold. Startup approved. Start. Departure runway. 2.
Roger.
Taxi to holding point runway. Departure run. Contact tower on. Startup. Cross run. Pushback approved at own discretion. Departure runway. 2. Pushback approved at own discretion. Pushback approved at own discretion.
Departure.
Taxi to holding point runway. Taxi. Contact tower on. 1 2 0 decimal 5 0 0.
Request pushback.
At parking. Information.
Pushback approved. Cross runway approved. Departure runway. 2 7. Startup approved. Startup approved. Departure runway. 2. Contact tower on. Taxi to pushback approved at own. Pushback approved at own. Contact. Startup approved. Startup approved. Taxi to holding point runway. Contact tower on. Taxi to hold. Startup. Taxi to hold. Startup approved. Contact tower. Taxi to holding point runway. Contact tower on. Departure. Contact tower on. Startup approved. Departure. Contact tower on. Pushback approved. Contact taxi to hold. Pushback approved at. Startup approved. Startup approved. Pushback approved at own discretion.
Roger.
Startup. Cross runway approved. Roger. Departure runway. 2 7. Taxi to holding point runway. 2 7.
Startup approved.
Pushback. Taxi to holding point runway. 2. Pushback approved at own discretion. Startup. Taxi to holding. Contact tower on. 1 2 0. Taxi to holding point. Departure runway. Taxi to holding point runway. Pushback approved at own discretion. Pushback approved at own discretion.
Request pushback.
Pushback approved at own discretion.
Roger. Request startup.
Startup approved. Report when taxi to holding point runway. 2 7. Roger. Taxi to holding point runway. Contact startup approved. Report when cross run. Startup. Pushback approved at own discretion. Departure runway. 2 7. Taxi to cross runway approved. Contact tower on. 1 2. Taxi to holding point runway. 2 7.
Holding point runway. 2 7.
Contact tower on. 1 2. Contact tower on. 1 2 0 decimal 5 0. Startup. Taxi to holding. Startup approved. Taxi to holding. Startup. Departure run. Taxi to holding. Contact. Departure runway. Pushback approved at own discretion.
Roger.
Departure runway. 2 7. When ready to start.
Departure runway. Contact. Departure runway. 3 4. Contact when ready to start.
Request startup.
Startup approved. Contact. Departure runway. 2. Startup approved. Contact. Pushback approved. Taxi to hold. Contact tower on. 1 2 0 decimal 5 0 0. Contact tower on. 1 2 0 decimal 500. Departure runway. Pushback approved at own discretion. Departure. Startup approved. Report when ready to taxi. Startup approved. Report when ready to taxi.
At parking.
Departure runway. Contact tower. Cross runway approved. Request startup. Startup. Taxi to hold. Startup approved. Report when. Taxi to holding point runway. Departure runway. 27. Taxi to holding point runway. 27. Taxi to holding point runway. Startup approved. Report. Contact tower on. Pushback approved at own discretion. Startup approved. Report when ready to taxi.
Startup.
Departure runway. 2. Taxi to contact departure. Taxi to holding point runway. 27. Startup approved. Taxi to holding point runway. Pushback approved at own discretion. Departure runway. Startup approved. Taxi to holding point runway. 27.
Roger.
Pushback approved at own discretion. Contact tower. Departure run. Taxi to holding. Pushback. Startup approved. Contact tower. Departure runway. Contact tower on. 1. Pushback approved at. Contact tower on. 1, 2, 0. Decimal. 5, 0, 0. Contact tower on. Pushback approved at own discretion. Roger. Contact tower on. Departure run. Pushback approved. Departure runway. Taxi to holding point runway. 27.
Departure runway.
Departure runway. 27.
Departure runway. 27.
Startup approved. Departure runway. Contact tower on. Pushback approved at own discretion.
Startup approved. Call you back when ready to
Pushback approved at own discretion.
Request.
Contact tower on. 1, 2, 0. Taxi to holding. Startup approved. Report when ready. Contact tower on. Taxi to holding. Startup approved. Pushback left. Startup approved. Report when ready to taxi. Departure runway. Contact tower on. 1, 2. Pushback startup approved. Pushback approved at contact. Startup approved. Report when ready to departure runway. 27. Startup approved. Report taxi to holding. Pushback approved at taxi to holding point runway. Contact tower on. Departure runway. Departure runway. Taxi to hold. Pushback approved at contact tower on. Departure runway. 27. Contact when ready to start. Startup approved. Report when ready to taxi. Taxi to holding point runway. Taxi to holding point runway. 2. Pushback. Startup approved. Report when ready to taxi.
Startup approved. Call you back when ready to taxi.
Taxi to holding point runway. 27. Request startup. Startup. Pushback. Cross runway. Contact. Startup approved. Startup approved. Taxi. Contact tower on. 1. Startup. Contact tower on. Pushback approved at departure. Contact. Taxi to holding point runway. 2. Contact tower on. 1, 2, 0. Decimal. Startup approved. Report when ready to taxi. Pushback approved at contact tower on. Taxi to holding point. Pushback approved at own discretion. Contact taxi to hold. Departure run. Taxi to holding point. Pushback approved at own discretion.
Roger.
Pushback approved at own discretion. Departure runway. Taxi to holding point runway. Pushback. Departure runway. 2, 7. Taxi to holding point runway. 3, 4. Cross runway approved. Departure runway. 2, 7. Contact departure runway. 2, 7. Contact tower. Pushback approved. Taxi to contact tower. Taxi to holding. Contact tower. Pushback approved at own. Taxi to holding point run. Startup approved. Contact tower on. Startup approved. Pushback approved at own. Taxi to holding point run. Departure runway. Pushback approved. Startup approved. Report when ready to taxi.
Roger. Taxi to holding point runway.
Startup approved. Report when ready to taxi. Pushback approved at own discretion.
Request taxi.
Contact tower on. Taxi to holding point runway. 2, 7.
Request pushback.
Startup approved. Report. Pushback approved at own discretion.
Startup approved.
Contact tower on. 1, 2, 0. Decimal. 5. Pushback approved at own discretion.
At parking. Information.
Depart. Taxi to holding point runway. 2, 7. Startup approved. Startup. Pushback approved at own discretion. Contact tower on. 1, 2. Taxi to holding. Startup approved. Taxi to holding. Contact tower on. 1, 2, 0. Decimal. Startup approved. Report when ready to taxi.
Request pushback.
Pushback approved at own discretion.
Roger.
Cross runway approved. Request taxi.
Roger.
Taxi to holding point runway. 2, 7. Taxi to holding point runway. Taxi to holding. Contact depart. Startup approved. Taxi to holding point runway. 2, 7. Departure runway. 2, 7. Startup approved. Report when ready to taxi. Contact tower. Pushback approved at own discretion.
Roger.
Request startup.
Rod.
Contact tower on. Startup approved. Report when taxi to holding. Start. Contact tower on. Startup approved. Pushback approved at own discretion.
Holding point runway 27. Holding point run.
Contact tower on. Departure runway. Contact tower on. 120. Taxi to holding point run. Contact tower on. Contact tower on. 12. Taxi to holding point runway. 27. Pushback approved at own discretion. Departure run. Taxi to holding point run. Pushback approved at own discretion. Departure runway. 27. When ready to start.
At parking.
Departure runway. 27. Contact when ready to start. Departure run. Contact tower on. Contact. Pushback approved at own discretion.
Departure runway